Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar from the Centre for Cultural Value. It's great to see so many people online from all over the world. I have to say we were anticipating around 100 people. So it's a lovely challenge to have. I think we've got about 530 registered, which will sadly make it a little less interactive than we were planning to, but hopefully there'll be lots of opportunities for people to interject, to ask questions. And we've got some great panel members as well who'll be able to make it as engaging and interactive as possible. So thanks for joining us this morning. My name's Ben Walmsley, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director of the Centre for Cultural Value. And our aim really is to really try and understand, analyse, work with policymakers and the sector to understand the differences that arts, culture, heritage and screen make to people's lives and to society. And like many of us, I think it's fair to say that, 6-9 months ago, we certainly weren't planning to do our first webinar around COVID-19. But it seemed to us that our first foray into engaging with the sector really needed to try and get to grips with some of these extreme challenges that the sector is facing. So we're really excited to be co-hosting this with the British Council. You're going to hear from Ian later on, who's going to present some of the findings from the British Council. Over the next 4 years, the Centre for Cultural Value will be hosting a series of events, hopefully not all online, many of which will be smaller and much more interactive. We're very keen to engage in dialogue with as many different people as we possibly can over the next 4 years of our activity. And we'll be saying a bit more later on about our programme launch, our Festival of Ideas that will be taking place in November. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the chair for this morning's session, who is the Centre co-director, Anne Torreggiani.
Yes, hello and welcome indeed to this fantastically well-attended seminar on cultural policy responses to COVID-19, the international perspective. And welcome to all of you. I think the numbers are rushing up, so we'll look out for all your colleagues. And I think as many of you already have, do pop your name and your interest and what you do in the chat, because it's all really interesting for us to think about who this community of interest is that's gathering together today. So as Ben said, there are 500 people here today, or there should be 500 people here today shortly. So I want to just quickly go over what we're going to be doing for the next 90 minutes, just so that we can navigate our way around it. But I wanted to just kick off by saying that lots of you gave us some feedback about what you were interested in at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that the range was very, very interesting indeed. And I think that in 90 minutes, we're not going to be covering all of that. But actually, I think we can see today's session as a really great start of a conversation. And we'll come on to the lots of different ways that we may be able to connect. This really interesting group of people have come together. And I bet we've never all been together for one big conference. So it's a very unusual mix. And let's hope that in a sort of post-COVID world, we may start some new conversations that we wouldn't have had in the olden days. Anyway, what we will be exploring today is a comparison of UK policy practices and responses to pandemic to date with those of other countries, and we'll be thinking both about aspects of straight COVID-related policy as well that have had a critical impact on the cultural sector, as well as those parts of policy directly, specifically aimed at supporting the cultural sector. First of all, though, I'm going to quickly go through a little bit of housekeeping, quick outline of what we're going to do before I introduce our first speaker. So. Do talk to each other in the chat. If I hope all of you know how to use your the strip that has all the actions that you can have along the bottom. You've got your chat screen there. You should have a Q&A prompt and so on. So do keep in touch with us through that mechanism. If you are interested in accessing the captions, you'll see on your control bar there that there's a little button for closed captions in Zoom, so you can we have a live transcriber, and you can also use the stream text link that you'll find in the chat if you want to use that mode. There will also be a transcript of the whole thing available later on and a recording as well. So just to confirm then that we are in fact recording this, of course. If you have any issues with that, please let us know. And if your name has not come up correctly in the list of attendees, please do message Mikey on the chat and he'll make sure that your name is changed to the correct one. So we have got 90 minutes with a very short break, and we are expecting some delightfully punchy inputs from our speakers. We're going to have a quick, we've already heard from Ben about the Centre for Cultural Value. Will be some scene setting, some wonderful scene setting about scenarios and the possibilities of the future from Franco Bianchini. Rachel Johnson will be talking about some of the research that the Centre for Cultural Value has already been doing and sharing some of the top line findings and getting some feedback from you that will go into the final report. Ian Thomas, Head of Evidence for British Council, is going to be giving us a fantastic nip around the world to see what's been happening elsewhere. And then after that, a chance for some questions. Please do use the Q&A function for your questions. I'll come on to that in a moment. And then after a short break, we'll come on to our panel, and then we should have about 15, 20 minutes of time to engage other questions and things that you have to answer, and hopefully get into some sort of distanced discussion. Right, so just very finally then, just to come on to the other parts of housekeeping. So what we'd really like you to do is, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. That's the easiest way for us to make sure that we're answering the questions that you're really interested in. You can vote up particular questions that you have an interest in, and we really encourage you to do that, so we're kind of getting to the nub of the debate. So please do use that as a way of engaging, but if you want to make comments and layer up the discussion, please use the chat to do that. If we have presented one of your questions or comments and you would like to actually speak to it, please use the hand up function, and then we can invite you into the conversation. I will explain that when we come back to the questions and answers again. So if that all makes sense, and with your permission, we will now move on to the debate for the day. So Franco, I hope you're ready. I'd like to introduce Franco, who will be, as I say, talking us through some of the concepts and ideas about what might happen post-COVID or through COVID for cultural policy. Franco, can I pass on to you?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Franco Bianchini. I'm one of the associate directors of the of the Center for Cultural Value, and also one of the founders of the Fitzcarraldo Foundation in Turin. And I would like to show the first slide, please. Yeah. Which is essentially a reflection on some macro scenarios, technological, economic, political scenarios related to the pandemic. Obviously, nobody knows exactly what is going to happen, but it's a fair bet to say that what will happen also in terms of cultural policy in the future will be dependent on political ideological outcomes, wider political ideological outcomes. For example, some of these scenarios are taken from research by the Zukunft Institute in Frankfurt and partly also by Nesta. There is a possibility that one of the political outcomes of the crisis will be a more authoritarian turn, which will be essentially a reduction of democracy, a reduction of scrutiny, and even a reduction of freedom potentially for artists and cultural producers, as well as for researchers. So greater control of statistics, manipulation of statistics, and a regime of a greater risk of censorship. But anybody who outlines this scenario in democratic systems is also saying that inevitably this scenario, such a scenario, would also lead to a permanent crisis, a situation of permanent crisis, because in society, at the same time, as we are observing in the US, for example, at the moment, there are movements to do with environmental sustainability, to do with race equality, that are in clashing with the possible authoritarian turn. So this is why this idea of system crash, permanent crisis is part of the forecasts for this particular scenario. There are also, there's also some of the thinkers around Nesta and the Zukunft Institute are saying that although there is a possibility of an authoritarian turn at government level in different countries, possibly also in the UK, this does not mean that at local level things are not going to change. So there could be an increasing difference between local action and central government action, with more and more attempts at city level and possibly even at neighborhood level or at village level, small town level, of developing something very different, very alternative. So the idea developed originally by the French sociologist, anthropologist Michel Maffezoli of neo-tribes, the greater popularity of ideas of post-growth, circular economies, the idea of post-tourism that has already emerged in the last few months in different countries, the idea of discovering your own locality as a tourist destination, are possibly going to coexist with an authoritarian turn. On the other hand, there is also a more optimistic scenario, a kind of reimagination of capitalism, more through a fusion of green ideas and of more radical left ideas. It is also a possibility, which would be based on visionary ideas like the Green New Deal, citizens' income, perhaps a shorter working week. So there is also the possibility of a post-coronavirus settlement that is not going to be based on greater control on this authoritarian turn, accompanied by often a populist attack on artists and also on independent researchers. So that's another scenario that is discussed by Nesta and the Zukunft Institute. What most commentators, with a few exceptions, seem to agree upon is the fact that there's not going to be, in the short or medium term, a return to normality because of the severity of the economic crisis and the unemployment crisis, essentially a depression in several countries that is just beginning now. So we're going to face a very difficult autumn and winter in different countries in Europe and also in North America. So the idea of restarting to some extent is mistaken. And some people are also talking about this period as the possible dusk of the Anthropocene, of a period during which we have led different species to extinction and in which we have created the conditions for environmental disaster. So if I see the next slide, please, the next one. So in terms of the more precise effects for the cultural sector, some are well known. There is a possible crisis of cultural philanthropy due to the redirection of resources to poverty relief and to health in different countries. There is also a risk of a loss of political status of cultural policy if cultural policy makers and the cultural sector don't play their cards right. So cultural policy could become deprioritized because of the severity, as I said earlier, of the economic and health crisis. Most countries have different kind of emergency plans to avoid collapse of the cultural sector, and this collapse is particularly serious, it seems, especially for medium-sized cultural organizations. There is a risk of growing exclusion for people suffering from different forms of poverty, partly because of the turn to digital, and we shouldn't forget that fast internet, fast broadband is not actually available to many people now, even in Europe, in the parts of Europe, but also due to the possibility of an increase in the cost of ticket prices, which is related to the need for smaller audiences for live events in particular. We have already seen a beginning of a growth of the arts and health, sometimes called in some countries cultural welfare agendas, and a much more sophisticated development of immersive technologies. So this crisis, a little bit like the Second World War, is clearly going to give impetus to a new technological revolution. And how do we build on the massive growth of amateur creative practices during the lockdowns in different countries is another huge question. Something really unprecedented, but there is a risk that these creative practices do not become really part of the daily life of people, even if, as I said, we have seen an explosion of creativity in the last few months. The next slide, please. So it is clear that what socially engaged arts organizations and also libraries, for example, can clearly play a very important role in reskilling people, in developing new skills to encourage people to find alternative employment, given that many people working in sectors like retail, hotel and catering, and also the cultural sector itself are going to lose their jobs, or they've already lost it. So there is clearly a growing importance of co-created projects in different cultural forms to help people deal with the psychological and social traumas of the pandemic. And there is also the possibility linked with pressure from the Black Lives Matter movement that we're going to see more multicultural and even more interestingly, intercultural projects that are going to value intercultural bridge builders that have often been marginalized in cultural management and cultural policy until now. It is also going to be more important probably to use cultural mapping as a method to identify hidden, relatively hidden resources in local heritage, local cultural activities to develop post-tourism and culture-based local development strategies. There is a huge debate on remodeling of cultural venues with the growing popularity of drive-in solutions, and also the growing importance of public spaces outside cultural venues. For example, the city of Vilnius in Lithuania redesigning planning regulations to give more space for cultural activities, but also for retail activities, bars and restaurants and cafes. There is the proposal by Obrist in the UK, the curator of the Serpentine Gallery, to learn from the New Deal in the US in the 1930s and to have essentially a major new public works infrastructure program that is going to give work to artists of different kinds, from theater, playwrights, to poets, to novelists, to visual artists. That's an interesting idea which could be linked with the infrastructure investment that is being used in different countries to try to relaunch and boost the economy to reduce the negative effects, the negative economic effects of the pandemic. So we go to the next slide, please, which is the last one. In terms of culture-led regeneration, not only urban, I would say, but also rural regeneration, there's a debate here, because at one level, some commentators are saying that given the severity of the depression and of the unemployment crisis, we cannot ditch the traditional notion of urban regeneration, which is focused on the creation of wealth and jobs. So a notion of urban regeneration, which traditionally has had to do with attracting tourists and using cultural activities as a lever to improve the image of places and therefore to attract investment of different kinds, including investment for property-led regeneration. It seems clear to me, nevertheless, that even if we try to use that model, we need to rethink things fundamentally, because there is such a crisis of the office, retail, hotel and catering sector and of the nighttime economy in many different cities, that it is unlikely that the role of culture in economic development will be the same in the future. Other commentators are saying that what is needed is a much more curative approach to urban regeneration now, and we need to think of the role of cultural activities, therefore, within strategies to reduce environmental pollution, improve air quality, and reduce also issues of loneliness, depression, and anxiety that have come to the fore for many people and are still there during the pandemic. So the more curative idea of urban regeneration, with a growing importance of health and environmental impacts, an idea much more 360 degrees holistic idea of regeneration, which could chime with the Agenda 2030 objectives of the UN. And within this, there are also possible new forms of cooperation between cities and rural hinterlands. There is growing demand in many housing markets across Europe for houses in the countryside with a bit of land, because people are afraid of having to survive other lockdowns within the confines of very small flats without gardens. And cultural organizations are also looking with interest at residencies, at performances, at experiments in cultural production in rural hinterlands. So we could begin to bridge this divide, which is also a cultural divide between very multi-ethnic cities with particular values and the rural hinterlands with more conservative values, which has been one of the main political cleavages in recent politics in the US and also in Europe. There is also clearly a return of the smart city agenda, the technological city, with therefore also important questions of democratic control and governance, which are still unresolved. The pandemic is also revealing a process of centralization of power by central governments, which is going to make operations with regional authorities and city councils quite difficult. And there is also the possibility of a negative ideological discourse about cities seen as unpatriotic, chaotic, dangerous, that could be exploited by right-wing populists in particular. Nevertheless, we also have to look at the positives, and there is the potential of an approach to cultural policy which would rebalance some of the geographical inequalities, which are seeing a concentration of funding, a concentration of the centers of excellence in different European countries, in the big cities, and also a concentration of the commercial cultural industries in the big cities. So I have finished. The last slide, I think, is simply my address and the website of the Center for Cultural Value. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing. What a lot of food for thought in 9 short minutes. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, if anyone would like to ask Franco some direct questions, please do use the Q&A function. You'll find that on the control panel. And if there's anything really interesting that you've seen that somebody else has asked, if you can upvote that. Just while you're, I know there have been some other questions that are more general and more about a debate, but at the moment, I'm just taking questions that are very specific to what Franco has just been talking about. And I want to say thank you while you're thinking of your questions for giving me such a balanced view about what the future might look like. I have to say, I'm so used to listening to doom-laden predictions about what might happen next, but I'm quite excited by the potential for a new deal for culture, where we see culture playing a much more central 360-degree function in society. And I particularly like this notion of a sort of a curative approach to urban regeneration. Really, really great. I'm feeling much more positive about the future. After 10 short minutes, Franco, I think it's really exciting and interesting. So have you any questions either from the chat or the Q&A just before we move on to our next speaker? You stunned us all in a good way.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat about the meaning of the word autarky that appears in the slides. That's basically a regime of self-sufficiency, of economic self-sufficiency, which is actually being talked about not only by right-wing politicians, because originally the term is associated with fascism, but also by more progressive politicians. So the idea of bringing back manufacturing functions to increase local resilience. Even Rachel Reeves, a Labour politician in the UK, has recently talked of the idea of nearshoring, so of bringing back some manufacturing functions to the UK to increase resilience in this potentially risky time. So that's autarky, I would say, is a negative way of describing that idea of being economically self-sufficient.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. There's a couple of really interesting questions here. I think we've probably got time for 2, so quickly upvote anything that you particularly like the look of. But Mark got in there quickly and was just asking about where we are. Where we are after. Okay, we're going to go with Mark Scott's question first. Where we are in lockdown at the moment. Do you feel that there are any that there's a risk, I guess, that immediate changes to cultural policy are likely to have a kind of excluding effect for audiences and participants?
Yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned it in one of the slides, and I think absolutely it is extremely worrying. In fact, we are seeing negative effects also on school children. All the data are showing that the school children which have been most negatively affected by not going to school are children from the poorer families. So the pandemic has not done anything significant in terms of reducing social inequality. If anything, it has increased them. So that question has to be very much at the forefront. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed that Rayanne King has got a very popular question here about this notion of curative approaches, and she asks, beg pardon, specifically about techniques for more cooperation between rural hinterlands and cities. Have you any thoughts? What should we do?
Yeah. Well, it is a question, potentially it is a question of reorganization of the functions of cultural organizations. I think if we are serious about that, it's clear that some of these functions have to be relocated. We need a much more polycentric idea of the city, perhaps enlarging the city to include the rural hinterland. So a sort of redefinition almost of the territory within which cultural organizations operate. One of the big problems is a financial and governance issue, because in the UK, in England, for instance, and in other European countries, the boundaries of cities are drawn so tightly that the cultural organizations located within cities are almost exclusively financed by the people who live in the city itself, although the audience often comes from the rural areas outside. So what I think I'm hoping personally would be that in recognition of these new realities, if there is a move by cultural organizations towards a more recognition of the rural hinterland, the local authorities of the rural hinterland themselves would be perhaps keener to come to some kind of idea of financial compacts, some funding agreements that would fund the cultural organizations located in cities. That's been a major stumbling block until now. That's a source of hostility between
some structural reorganization in a sense about how we and perhaps some incentivization of that as well. And I think because I'm going to take one last question. I think Brian's got a very interesting question that I'm going to save for the discussion later, but I'm just going to put Tessa's question to you, just because it is an important idea. Could you elaborate just very briefly on what you mean by a curative approach?
Yes, curative in a literal sense. This is not my term, by the way. It is very, I've taken it from the French debate on urban regeneration. I think what they mean is precisely something therapeutic in a way. Therefore, we are aware of the fact that we need to reduce environmental risk. Therefore, an improvement in a reduction in the use of cars is something that we can do in different cities. Again, there are major barriers here because there is an hostility to cyclists, for example, in lots of cities in Europe. So the debate in France, for instance, talks about to what extent we can encourage a cycling culture and what can cultural activities do to favor that. Curative also in recognition of the fact that participation, our direct participation in making theater or other cultural activities can have a therapeutic effect in terms of making new friends, in terms of therefore reducing levels of loneliness and also improving our self-confidence. So I think by curative, I mean precisely that. I just mean, therapeutic.
Both direct and indirect.
In indirect ways in terms of the effects on the environment, and in direct ways in terms of our own mental and physical well-being.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think some really rich stuff there. So do, if you have thoughts, ideas, and indeed enrichments to that way of thinking, please do, or disagreements, please do capture those ideas in the chat. Thanks ever such a lot, Franco. I know you're going to stay around and will be with us for the discussion a bit later on. Thank you so much for that. We're now going to move on to hear from Rachel Johnson, who I believe is representing her research and John's research, who is, I believe that John is just recently having a baby. So you're going to be covering both bases and talking through some of the headline findings of the digest that you've been working on for Centre for Cultural Value and your recent comparative study. So Rachel, can I hand over to you?
Right, thank you very much, Anne, and nice to meet you all digitally. I'm just taking control of the slideshow here. Okay. So as Anne said, I'm going to be covering for John today, who's away with, I think, a very, very good reason. I'll be talking about the Centre for Cultural Values research into what has and hasn't happened in the UK and indeed across Europe and other parts of the world during the COVID pandemic. Oh, okay. The slight lag on the slides there. Okay, so I'll start with John's findings. So our initial research found that there were significant differences between the UK's four nations approaches to cultural policy in the pandemic. So there were these two key themes that began to emerge. And the first one is really around emergency funding, grants and bursaries. While all four nations offered emergency grants to individual artists and cultural practitioners, the grants offered by Arts Council England seem to have quite different eligibility criteria from those offered by Creative Scotland and the Arts Councils of Wales and Northern Ireland. What was notable was that Arts Council England's emergency grants required applicants to earn at least 50% of their income through self-employed activities. And this correlated with the whole UK government's requirements for the self-employed income support scheme. The other three nations' arts councils did not stipulate this requirement. Indeed, Creative Scotland's bridging bursary was specifically designed for individuals who are not eligible for the furlough or self-employed income support schemes. Now, this had implications for artists and creative workers with complex portfolio careers and those on short-term or precarious contracts would fall short of the 50% threshold in England. It effectively meant that these people could not apply for either the self-employed income support scheme or the additional bursaries and grants that were offered by Arts Council England at the time. But perhaps the most obvious division came in the allocation of the £1.57 billion Cultural Recovery Fund that was announced by the UK government in July. Westminster, the English government, divided the majority of the funding between cultural arm's length bodies in order to save the so-called crown jewels. We're talking about long-established organisations that tended to have venues attached. In contrast, both the Scottish and Northern Irish governments have allocated significant portions of funding to directly assist individuals, freelance creatives and cultural workers in the sector. To a certain extent, the Welsh government seemed to follow Westminster in their allocation of this funding. So we have a divide here between support for established organisations and venues and an emphasis on support for individual cultural practitioners. And I'm just going to speak to the first point on this slide because it's what I know. So we also found that inequality within the cultural sector has been further illuminated by the pandemic. For example, an all-party parliamentary group for arts, health and well-being have submitted a report focusing on arts and culture as part of the Doreen Lawrence review into the impact of coronavirus on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. So as I was saying earlier, the pandemic is actually accentuating social inequality, and this goes for within the cultural sector as well. Interestingly, in Northern Ireland, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland partnered with the Atypical University to produce the only emergency grant specifically designed for deaf and disabled artists and cultural practitioners. And so there are some interesting signs of types of funding out there that do have this focus on reducing inequality in the sector as well. So what emerges from John's findings is quite a complex picture of support for the cultural sector in the UK. The different British nations' responses to the pandemic raise questions about which parts of the cultural ecosystem policymakers are prioritising and where support needs to be directed in order to sustain a more robust and perhaps more equal cultural sector in the UK going forward. John's work highlighted a possible shortfall in particularly England's support for individual cultural practitioners, above all freelance, self-employed and precariously employed practitioners. And there's an implication that the inequalities in the sector were exacerbated by the pandemic, and thus we need adequate support mechanisms that cater for the whole cultural ecosystem, the whole spectrum of cultural practitioners. And this is sort of where my research comes in. I'm going to present a snapshot of the research I've done, which aims to consider the ways in which UK can better support these individuals and perhaps create a more robust infrastructure that may allow us to be more responsive and perhaps respond a little more justly to crises like the one we're currently in. My research focused on social security for cultural practitioners in Europe, Canada, and the UK, both during and before the pandemic. By social security, I'm referring to schemes like national insurance, state instruments designed to offer income support for people who may be experiencing periods of unemployment, but also support such as pensions and disability allowances, and so on. My aim here is to share with you that really the provocation that led me to start researching social security for cultural practitioners across the world, to share why it seems important to start having discussions about this now. So the first point here is that when I say we know, what I mean is many reports show. These reports are well grounded in evidence, but they are, of course, open to discussion and debate, and indeed that is why we're here today. So the first point is that the value of the cultural practitioner is enshrined in the 1980 UNESCO recommendations concerning the status of the artist. And we can raise the point there that that's the status of the artist, not the cultural practitioner, which is something we maybe need to look at going forward. Okay, UNESCO still monitors its members' implementation of these recommendations, and this monitoring continues to find that we have much work to do in order to acknowledge, support, and compensate the work of, again, not just artists, but cultural practitioners in general. Second, a series of studies show that cultural practitioners repeatedly and increasingly face conditions of employment that increase their risk of poverty. We're talking about unstable employment, so short-term contracts, commission-based work, and so on. Low incomes, which is often an effect of this unstable employment, and a large divide in incomes where you have the sort of superstar artists at the top and a large wealth gap between those below, as it were. These are shown by reports from national and supranational organisations, such as, again, UNESCO, but also the EU's Institute for Comparative Cultural Research and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. As I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has accentuated inequalities, including income inequalities. Okay, that includes people with things like portfolio work potentially missing out on income support in England. Now, during the pandemic and during my research, I found that most countries' guidance for practitioners seeking support directed them first to social security or social security-like measures. This is, for example, the self-employed income support or furlough schemes in the UK. There was a sense here that the primary support for workers in the cultural sector were intended to be these social security schemes, while emergency grants were really trying to fill in the gaps for a limited number of individuals in some cases. What also emerged was a divide between nations, particularly in Europe, that already had established social security schemes that targeted cultural practitioners specifically, and nations that didn't. Countries like Germany, France, and Austria were able to extend the protections for cultural practitioners that were already provided before the pandemic by schemes like artist social insurance. Okay, this is Germany's national insurance-like scheme that's specifically for artists. Now, the full picture is, of course, nowhere near clear yet. We need to do a lot more research into the effects of these schemes and their responsiveness during the pandemic. But initially, it appears that these countries with targeted social security in place were able to do three things, both before and, importantly, during the pandemic. So first, they could identify quite easily who was a cultural practitioner, at least within their own terms. Okay, these schemes meant that the state had a list of those whom were deemed to be cultural practitioners. That is usually on the basis of income, but with flexible income requirements. And these people had their own specific place within the state's infrastructure, okay, within tax, pension, social security schemes. The second thing these countries could do is, again, this is the key point, they could provide targeted support, including using eligibility criteria that are adapted specifically to cultural practitioners' typical conditions of employment. This also meant that during the pandemic, in the face of the huge challenges that the cultural sector and its workers were meeting, nation states with these schemes could just adjust the eligibility criteria and the levels of support to make them more open and have greater coverage for cultural practitioners who were greatly affected by loss of income because of the lockdowns. Now, finally, what we found, and this is very much emergent evidence, what we found was that countries with these established schemes were actually able to spend less as a percentage of GDP on extraordinary measures for the cultural sector. Okay, so countries like Germany were spending less on emergency grants and funding because a lot of the support was being channeled through these established social security schemes. So in short, it appears that developing a more robust social security policies that effectively address cultural practitioners' typical conditions of employment may be something worth looking into as we start rebuilding in future. And with that in mind, I'm just going to leave a slide on the screen of the different schemes that I've identified, which I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A or the discussion later. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel, because that was an awful lot of research packed into a short few slides. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, I'm actually broiling, if you can be broiling the questions I'm dying to ask you, but I'm going to myself and ask everybody else just to bear with us, because I'm going to segue directly into Ian Thomas, who's Head of Evidence at the British Council's presentation, partly because you've given us a brilliant understanding about where we are in the UK at the moment, but actually I think Ian's going to give us a fantastic whistle-stop tour about the kind of innovation and changes that we're seeing globally in many other countries. So if you can hold on to your questions, again, use the Q&A, but can I ask you to start, you can start storing up questions for Rachel now, but can I ask that we'll do a Q&A session directly after Ian's finished talking? So Ian, you're there. Marvellous. I'm going to shut up. Good luck.
Thank you. Good afternoon all. So yes, I'm going to do a kind of a whistle-stop tour of outside of the UK, from kind of learning and insights we've been gathering as British Council through our global network. So this is kind of a very summary. We have a series of articles, insight articles and research reports on our website, which flesh out some of these themes a lot more than these slides do. So just to start with a kind of snapshot of the challenge that the global arts sector is facing. So this is from a survey that we're currently doing at the moment in India, exploring the creative economy and the impact of COVID-19 in India. The survey is a tracking survey, so this is the first report we published in July. We're still tracking over the next 6 to 8 months, so we're still doing survey work at the minute. But we want to understand the immediate impact on artists' lives, arts organisations and their audiences, and the responses by governments, NGOs and stakeholders in India as the sector goes through COVID, recovers, sustains and maybe grows. So there's 3 kind of key findings there from our kind of India Creative Economy report. One, that 41% of the Indian creative sector stopped functioning during the lockdown. 61% of organisations established between 4 and 10 years have stopped during the lockdown. And that 70% of responses are cancelled or postponed up to 7 events, indicating temporary disruption to business continuity and the loss of income since late March 2020. This is an ongoing piece of research, but these are some of the initial challenges that the sector in India particularly is facing. Just moving to Australia, so the Australian Council for Arts is doing an audience outlook monitor at the minute. This is a report that they published in July. This is an ongoing piece of research, but this is particularly looking at audience responses and the challenges around audiences to the arts and cultural sector. And this is a snapshot from Australia. And you can as of July, 4 in 10 people prefer digital program rather than attending in person right now. Slightly more people are paying for online experiences, and they're spending more online. Almost 2 in 5 have spent more than $50 in the past fortnight. So, and we're also starting to see in Australia, audiences are increasingly ready to return to attend cultural events. So we're starting to see an upward trend through the Audience Outlook Monitor. This is a snapshot report. This is ongoing piece of research, and it's available on the Australian Council for Arts website. We're also seeing from the US, so the New York Times did a poll, again published at the end of May, that found that theatregoers are hesitant to return and worried that people around them will not follow COVID safety rules. And we're starting, this is echoing also some of the findings from the Australian report, but also this is from a snapshot in the US. So what are we seeing from the sector internationally responding? So how's the sector responding internationally to this? So you're seeing a lot of digital, but also digital innovation and digital democratization. So we're starting to see this, an example from Russia, for example, in their museums, where they're using digital access to improve disabled access for audiences and to examine their disabled access policy. We're also seeing digital channels being used for collaboration, for protests, for campaigning for the arts. So for example, in Ukraine, we've got an example there of kind of how they're using lighting installation to kind of highlight the challenges that the sector is going through in Ukraine. And also from Canada, for example, the Festival of Social Distancing, an online artist community made to celebrate and showcase the work of many artists around the world who have been affected by social distancing. So yes, we're seeing culture going digital, but also it being innovative and also being used to improve access and also for campaigning and for collaboration. We're also seeing practical things around how cultural organisations globally are using digital ticketing so to help manage access to museums, for example, and art galleries, to help them manage their visitor flows, enable contactless entry, no need to face-to-face or touchscreen purchases. And we're also seeing, for example, in China, where they're coming together as museums, where they have a shared QR code system that allows online booking through a centralized booking system, which makes it simple for visitors to plan and arrange multiple visits to multiple different cultural venues through one booking system and one QR system. We're also seeing a variety of support for the sectors, different support. So, for example, from France, for example, the French have put in place a £2 billion recovery, €2 billion recovery plan for their sector. Arts Council Korea have announced additional support for performing arts venues. For example, last week in Sweden, their Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Finance committed the largest ever cultural budget. For example, in Italy, we're seeing support for freelancers back in March with a 48 million euro package of allowance for freelancers. And for example, in Malaysia, we're seeing income tax relief worth roughly about $231 per person to reduce entry fees and hotel rates for tourist attractions to stimulate domestic tourism. So yes, there's government financial support, but we're also seeing sector peer-to-peer support. So for example, in New York, 200 arts leaders come together for a daily Zoom call, sharing expertise, exploring solutions together across art forms and across cultural organizations of all sizes as a peer-to-peer support group. We're seeing in Mexico, for example, through HACRA, that they're helping indigenous communities, indigenous artists, emerging artists, digitally through coaching, peer-to-peer support, signposting to opportunities. So we're starting to see, yes, governmental support, but also grassroots peer-to-peer support as being an important part of the response. We're also seeing a different normal. So, for example, the Istanbul Fringe Festival has gone into a hybrid format. So international artists will be able to perform digitally, while local artists will be able to perform live with social distancing in place. We're also seeing in the US, for example, a play written particularly for Zoom. And we're starting to see art productions adapted and written for digital platforms. For example, again in the US, we have this play at home, for example, which new plays intend to take no more than 10 minutes to read, that are free, that enables anyone to read or perform them at home or by video conference. We're also seeing rethinking of audience engagement. So, for example, the LA Bill will give portrait recitals on your doorstep. We're seeing in Ukraine vertical concerts on the roof of Kiev's hotels. We're seeing in Uruguay, for example, the Ministry of Culture and Education actually investing in buying productions that will be later presented in educational institutions and community organisations, and kind of supporting educational arts education work. And then just some quick final thoughts, just to summarise what we're kind of seeing. So we're seeing that COVID-19 is changing the way people engage with arts culturally and creatively. We see there's an underlying demand to engage with arts and culture is remaining strong internationally. We are seeing arts and cultural organisations faced with decisions about how to connect with audiences and how to adapt to the new changing circumstances in creative and sustainable ways, adapting business models, ways of working, how they engage and work with their audiences. For example, the World Bank published back in August an interesting article that looked at culture in COVID recovery, which highlights the potential to accelerate social, economic, and recovery from the pandemic through the use of culture-based approaches for city reconstruction and recovery in post-crisis situations. So in final thought, the crisis has highlighted how important it is to engage mutually beneficial collaboration. So echoing some of the thoughts that Franco was having with other sectors that foster innovation, innovation-led recovery through, for example, scientific research, digital entrepreneurship, community action, and international cooperation. Conscious that was a very whistle-stop tour, and you can read on our website kind of in-depth reports that, for example, coming out of India, and also our regional reports that are coming out from across the different regions of the different responses that the sectors is doing.
That's great. That's a brilliant piece of navigational stuff, Ian. So as you see, there's very, very rich stuff that you can go and explore some more about. So it's really good to have some pointers. So I'm going to just invite you now to think about any questions. Again, sort of, we've got some lovely ones here that we're going to save for the debate, but anything that's really specific for Rachel and Ian about what they've been talking about. While you're just gearing up for that, I'll just, you know, what I find really interesting about what you were saying there, Ian, is that I don't think there's one of those really interesting innovations that we haven't seen mirrors of somewhere here in the UK. And I think what's really interesting is where could the conversations go around the kinds of experimentation that's taking place? Because for sure, doing something out there new for the first time, the kind of learning that you get from the exchange around that could be really exciting. And I think what, interestingly, again, we haven't seen any direct funding that is for those kinds of experimentation that treat them as experiments. So something really interesting emerging as a theme there. So I'm going to, Rachel, Ian, feel free to turn your microphones back on again. There's a question here from Susan Jones. Do our arm's length arts policy funding agencies in effect hinder the systemic support that Rachel is talking about that is occurring in some other countries? What's your view on that, Rachel?
Well, I think it's an area that needs far more research and far more sort of mapping about how these two parallel systems sort of work. There are countries that I was researching in Europe that had what I gestured to at the final slide, a mixed support, mixed approach of having more social security style support and grants and bursaries and things like arts councils. So Finland is quite an interesting example there, where they also have an arts council based approach with a lot of funding, including actually social security style funding being channeled as grants and bursaries for cultural practitioners through the council. So it's a mixture of the two in a sense. But there isn't yet any research quite into how well that works and how well those two things interact. One thing that we do find in Finland is that they have a scheme of artist pensions where they're awarding grants through the arts councils to exceptionally talented artists so that they can get pensions, and that's about 50 throughout the year. So they're trying to strike some sort of balance between encouraging excellence and mitigating against the risk of poverty. Now that's been quite roundly criticised by different lobbying agencies and arts bodies within Finland, such as the Visual Artists Organisation of Finland, in saying that, you know, that isn't doing enough. There is still huge income inequality experienced by visual artists in this case. So there's some emerging evidence there that maybe the two approaches aren't quite compatible, and we need to look at having perhaps a stronger kind of baseline infrastructure that would then ensure a reduction in income inequality for cultural practitioners within the sector.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know that in some of the research that John was doing, again, this notion that there are some little bits and pieces of schemes which are to do with introducing artists into different situations. So in a way, there's a sort of a more direct link between being an artist and the value that you may bring to the current situation. And I just think that takes us back to Elunid's question here. It's quite a long question, but just talking about the funding of Arts Council Wales. And I was going to ask both of you what you thought about this, but the notion, so if you go down the questions a little bit, but the notion that the Cultural Recovery Fund in Wales is specifically linked to the role of artists in around well-being values. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, whether this particular package of support represents quite an interesting way of thinking about things.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that John would be really good at answering, but I know that he highlighted Wales as an interesting example, and particularly for their well-being values and for the centering culture in their policy around well-being as well. So I think, you know, that is potentially a model that we could look at across the UK going forward. Yeah. Again, I would have to defer to John and to defer to the research digest that he produced about this.
Yes, read more. Any final questions there? Do use your Q&A before we just go and have a little break. Any last thoughts? Anything in the chat that I've missed? But Ben, tell me if I've missed anything.
Not really. I just wondered if Eluned wanted to come back and give us a bit more insight and his own views. I think we've unmuted you, Eluned, if you want to chip in.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yes, it was just to flag up really the pioneering work that's been going on in Wales around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which came into law here in 2015. And it's, you know, it's been 20 years in the making really, and it's there now as a sort of a roadmap that helps us through this recovery. And it's one that in Wales, culture has been made the fourth pillar of sustainable development, which means that all public bodies in Wales have a duty towards culture and language, which is, I mean, it's not answering all the challenges that we have, but at least we're part of the mix and how we're responding to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's also going to be really interesting how this cultural contract, which is yet to be shared fully, will play out, because there's an economic contract that Welsh Government gives as part of its investment into economic development. And now there's going to be this cultural contract, which will include social equalities, diversity elements, as well as our commitment to fair trade. So interesting development, and I don't think we've got the answers, but there's a useful roadmap.
No, but a really interesting one to watch, and I can see that's already prompted some quite interesting debate and interest in the chat. And again, a little bit like some of the examples that Ian was pointing us to earlier on, you know, these things where actually, you know, the kernel of idea is turning into something, you know, that is being, I mean, I know this was a pre-COVID idea, but actually it's accelerating the progress around something. So what I suggest we do, we don't have any more questions at the moment, and it is now time for a quick 5-minute break. Don't forget, Rachel and Ian are going to be with us for that panel section, which we're going to be, for the debate rather, which we're going to be going straight into after we've heard from our panellists directly after our break. So if you would like to take 5 minutes, do leave your, do stay on, but just, just take a break. We will be coming back to talk to both of our panellists' responses at exactly 12:35. So see you in about 5 minutes. Okay, thanks a lot everybody so far. Speak to you soon. Well, hello everybody. I hope you're back from your break and you have your cup of coffee in hand. Sadly, I didn't quite get to the kettle myself. I hope that they're now with us, but I would really like to introduce you to our panel, who we have invited to respond to the responses that we've had, so we've invited rather to respond to the talks that we've had so far, and relate it a little bit to their own experiences, perhaps highlighting some of the implications that they see for practice and for the future of cultural policy and the cultural sector. So can I, without further ado, invite Moira Sinclair, Chief Executive of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and Chenine Bhathena, Creative Director of Coventry 2021, to come forward and give us a quick fire response to everything they've heard so far. Moira, are you going first?
I am, I think.
Marvellous, good stuff. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. My head is swimming with all the information that we've just been given. I mean, it's really clear that COVID's exposed inequalities vividly. Inequalities we knew were there already after that extended period of austerity. And it's really clear that the impact has not been the same for everyone. I think the context is really important for us to remember if we're trying to make the case for culture and cultural value. The systemic link between health and poverty can't be ignored, nor can the underinvestment in the care of older people. And the attainment gap and employment options for young people are bleak across the board. I think the inequalities in the cultural sector, others have talked about, but you know, the high fixed costs spawned by larger revenue dependent institutions, the vulnerability of livelihoods for freelancers. I think the inequalities that reside in the who accesses funded arts and culture and why it's funded are matched by the inequalities of who makes it and who gets paid for it. And Franco touched on some of those things. I completely agree that there won't be a return to normal. I think the urge to create and to connect and to make sense of the world has never not been part of human experience. There will always be arts and culture, but the funded cultural system will undoubtedly be under pressure. And, you know, pressure creates opportunities as well as threats, and I don't want to be negative about everything. From my perspective, I think there will be less arts organisations, certainly in the short to medium term. The UK and international response, for that matter, simply can't rescue at the scale that's needed and can't make a special case in the light of, for example, retail closures and other industries' meltdown. So that context is, again, important. The emergency response from government has been critical, but it's been very focused on immediate need. And from our perspective, we think that 2021 is going to be extremely difficult. We're seeing a lot more collaboration, partnership and place-based working, some of which we've been funding. I think cultural organisations are working together differently and working together with the wider civil society differently. And I'd like to see a lot more of that and some really honest conversations about merging teams and activity as a result, better recognition that plays to the strength of different institutions and their networks and relationships with communities. I think that could mean less duplication and a much richer offer actually at the local level. We're going to need more funding explicitly to support this kind of operational work than we've had before. And we've heard that that's happening elsewhere, so there's some learning for us. I think the term cultural democracy is something we're hearing more, recognising the legitimacy of people's existing cultural values and practices and choices, which arguably were on display in the shared paintings in windows and the music making and the dancing and the online choirs. Franco mentioned that too. I'd like us to retain much more focus on the local and the wants of communities and see that communities are making decisions about the cultural lives they want and are supported with the resources and partnerships they need to pursue that. I think Arts Council's Let's Create strategy has the potential to support that, but follow through is going to be needed. And what's really interesting about that Welsh example is that culture was so explicitly embedded at the national strategic conversation about society and well-being. I'm not quite sure that's happening across the board. Will be really interesting to see whether we can balance that call for cultural democracy with what Franco identified as the possibility of political authoritarianism. Whether local begins to trump national in cultural funding terms will also be interesting. And the parallels to movement building with climate change and race equity activists should absolutely be recognised, and that move to action in response to COVID and Black Lives Matter should stay. We want the arts and cultural sector to be more diverse and inclusive in its leadership and workforce, and in which artists and art forms are supported. There'll be something very interesting about whether we can go beyond a classical Western canon as we come out of COVID. That pressure to respond really needs to be maintained. And Franco is right. Cultural philanthropy could be refocused in the coming months to redress that balance. Digital innovation plays into all of that. I echo the challenge of the digital divide. We saw profoundly, particularly in the schooling context, that access to tech kit, such as laptops, has been as much of an issue as access to broadband. Notwithstanding, I think there's some fascinating global learning here, and I echo your call. I think we should be sharing much more about that, much more about what's a meaningful and engaging cultural offer online, much more about how artists are responding to that call and how audiences are responding to. Couple of final thoughts from me. Universal basic income, really interesting. I'm not sure yet where I stand on it. I'm not sure it will deliver equity. I think essentially at the rate it would need to lift everyone out of poverty, it's probably unaffordable in the country at the moment, and it would fail to take into account the higher needs that many have because of structural and systematic barriers. But I'm open to be challenged on that, and I think the poll was pushing me to be challenged on that. There's clearly a need to do work to ensure that artists and freelance cultural practitioners, the way we earn money is better understood by government. And I'd like to see action taken now to address cultural practitioners' specific conditions of employment by the UK government. The report recommends it, and I think it's long overdue. Also improving access to training and skills, making that cost deductible for freelancers, for example. There's been mention of the idea of a national portfolio of artists. I've been talking about this for about 10 years on and off. I think the big question there is who will define who those artists are. Thinking back to that Finland example, based on what criteria? If it's artistic excellence and or track record, using that kind of language, we still have the risk of gatekeepers and a reinforcing of the status quo. What happens to everybody else? Assuming there's a static pot of money, will that mean less is available for those starting out and for those making work as well? Lobbying, I think we need to look at for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. That's the replacement for EU funding in the UK. That will be a centralised policy response and focused, I think, on the government's growth agenda. So the language may not be palatable for everyone here, but we need to argue for recognition of the cultural sector's contribution. Again, the local manifestation of that contribution will be really critical. But if we don't make the case for the relationship with growth, the resources won't flow. So I think there's something there. And lastly, cultural education. You'd expect me to mention it in some shape or form because it's an area that we've been funding in for a long time. The question for me is, what skills and attributes do our young people need to be genuinely creative, to have their imagination, to be connected, to be resilient in a post-COVID world? One of my teams has just attended an event and sent me a reminder that school is community and community is school. This is not an education topic per se. It's about the kind of country we want to live in and what COVID has revealed about that to us and the role that culture can play in thinking about that.
Moira, brilliant. Thank you so much. Now my head's spinning. Fantastic. What a set of brilliant questions. Thank you so much. Well, we captured them. We're not going to answer them all today, but I think it set us a very, very useful agenda. Chenine, do you have some more head spinning questions for us?
Hi everyone.
Hiya.
Wow. What a lot of information to take on board. It's been a brilliant morning, so thanks everyone for all your input and insights. It's been wonderful. I think in Coventry, I've been down in Coventry now for a couple of years, and obviously we've been planning towards having a major spotlight on the city over the next year. And I think when we came here back in 2018, having won the bid and coming into the role, we very quickly realised that culture is about people and community and places, and there's such a wonderful grassroots community of artists and creatives in our city, and what the pandemic has really demonstrated is the real fragility of all of that, the high risk nature of this world that we all work in, the real boom bust feeling of the artists and the creatives that work in this sector, but aligned with that, as Moira was discussing, also looking at the artists and cultural workers in the wider community and the issues that other people in the wider community face and the challenges they face. And I think what we've realized is, particularly when we look at the whole discussion around freelancers and self-employed and who was able to apply for money and who wasn't, is there's a real lack of understanding of how our sector actually is set up and works, and the real intricacies and the ecosystem of how the arts and cultural industry happens. And also, the real dependency really on people who are able to be in that sector because they have existing wealth or maybe partners or family that can support them. And for those that don't have that, they've been in real dire straits in this period. I mean, we, through the City of Culture programme, have had to quickly just get money to people so they can pay bills, pay their rent, pay for Wi-Fi, increase their Wi-Fi allowance so they can do Zooms. I mean, it's been really so clear about the fragility of the sector. And I think what's also been highlighted to us is how people are paid, how artists are paid, where that pay comes from. And when the wider ecosystem of the sector falls, that they've fallen as well. And a lot of the artists in Coventry are also dependent on the education system, on social care, on the local authority, on the third sector, and everybody during this period has obviously come across lots of challenges. So I think what we've seen and what's been demonstrated is this real fragility, and I suppose it raises questions about how we reinforce the infrastructure. Can we reinforce the infrastructure as we look forward and design the future for communities and keeping art, culture and creativity in our communities? And really, how do we demonstrate the worth and the value that artists play in communities? And one of the things that we've done as part of our programme in Coventry for 2021 is to really look at how we embed artists and creative producers into third sector organisations. So we're really working with communities who are up against it in terms of the poverty line, who are struggling to eat, who are struggling to get homes, permanent homes, people who are really struggling with health issues, people with real severe disabilities who are really struggling to engage in the city, and young people who are really at risk in so many different ways of being left behind and their futures really badly impacted. So we've really tried to look at how we embed creative people in all of those different communities so that we can really understand what's going on and be there to support those communities. And it's been talked about through the meeting and the role of artists in those different communities, with amateur groups, with community groups. And I think it's really gone to show how important that is. And luckily we've been here in place and been able to do that, and that isn't the case obviously in so many places. So I think what we've seen is it's allowed us to build much stronger networks, to have much clearer communication, to be much better connected. And I think, as we go forward, there's so much learning that we can take from that. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is when I worked for the Mayor of London, we did a lot of investigation into key workers and whether artists and creatives could kind of get key worker status. And even if they're not called key workers, how do we make the case for artists, the value of artists to society and community as a crucial, critical role that they play? And we've seen it during this pandemic, the way that artists have rolled up their sleeves and got in there with communities and kept things moving. So really, beyond thinking about universal basic income, is it also about low-cost homes and rents? Is it also about discounted travel, discounts on bills, priority access to healthcare? I think it's really important we think about pensions and elderly care as well for artists, and looking at a whole life benefit system for artists, which is not just about giving cash out to people. I think the national portfolio issue is interesting, because actually when I worked with Moira at the Arts Council back in the early 2000s, we launched a scheme where we supported independent artists and independent creative producers with grants. And we ran it as a pilot, but unfortunately the red tape, the bureaucracy, the paperwork, it makes it impossible for those independent workers to do their work, and they end up having to kind of build a company around themselves in order just to fulfill the requirements of getting that money. So my worry would be that if we use an existing system that doesn't work for everyone already, why would it work in the future? So those were just some of my thoughts. I think that greater connection between artists and the third sector is really important. I would love to explore wider sector initiatives, not just from the arts and cultural sector, and look at how other sectors manage very bespoke vocational workforces like ours, and be very clear and make a very clear campaign about the very unique nature of our sector and how it works. And where people come from, so we can really tackle inequality, access and inclusion, and really think about the role of citizens as we move forward, because as we can see, they play a massive role in the arts and culture sector. Sorry, I'm going to stop speaking there, but those are just some of my thoughts.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Chenine. That's really brilliant. I mean, I really just want to pick up your call for a kind of redesign of the infrastructure, if you like. I think that feels like a really common thread that's come through all of the presentations in one way or another. And actually, in a way, I think you're all talking about thinking as radically as we can, you know, beyond perhaps even the known things like universal basic income, but actually we're pushing it, saying, are there more outward-looking ways of working, more partnership, more collaborative ways of working beyond our culture sector bubble, which I'm hearing quite loudly through what everybody's saying, and this kind of emphasis on, you know, let's take the experiments further. So we haven't got very long. I'm going to say, if you've got a really burning question, get it in there now on the Q&A. I'm going to go with Brianna's question because it's got the most votes at the moment, and it feels like a really interesting one. It was to Franco, but I'm going to open this up to my other fellow panelists because it's a great question, isn't it? If you were going to push forward 5 or even 3 or 2 policy points to get a new deal for culture that is green, what would you suggest? It's a good one. It's there at the top of the questions, panelists. So Franco, are you still with us? Do you want to have a quick stab at that first? No. Franco, are you there? Can we hear you?
Yes, yeah.
Ah,
well, no, I personally agree with the first 2 points. How do we develop that? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced yet by the Green Party cultural policy, for example, whether it has a lot to add to get to 5 points. I'm not quite sure. So we probably need a little bit more research on that. Looking perhaps at the local Agenda 21 for culture, what organizations like United Cities and local government are recommending. But I struggle to get to the 5 points, I have to say, at the moment. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're on mute, Anne.
sorry, does anybody else want to come back on that point about a new deal for culture that is green?
Well, I think...
We can hear you. Go. Moira, please.
I think what I was trying to emphasize was, I think, the supremacy of the local, and I think that could have a huge impact. You know, thinking globally about the way that people are traveling across the globe at the moment and the impact that that's had, and then thinking specifically about the arts sector and the way the arts sector has, in the past 10 years, certainly transported orchestras around the globe, the huge visual art fairs, which have required enormous amounts of transportation. I think there is something there where one could make local have more supremacy in the hierarchy of funding and policy settings, which would be a really interesting thing. Yeah, so that's the big one for me.
Yeah, I love that. I've got some great phrases to take away in my kit bag after this, actually, but I quite like the supremacy of the local. And again, it seems to feel, it ties together quite a lot of the kind of drivers and things we've been talking about, doesn't it? I think we probably only got time for one more question, perhaps two. There's a great one from here from Julie, that she was coming back to you, Moira, in particularly about what does fewer cultural organisations actually mean?
Yeah, I thought someone might pick up on that. I just don't think that there will be the possibility of rescuing everything. Certainly not from a philanthropic side of things. We're not big enough, even collectively as a group. And I think that's going to mean closures. What I don't want to see, and maybe that's another policy piece along those five, is that disproportionately landing on the small and grassroots rather than the bigger ones. And actually the bigger ones are more vulnerable at the moment because they are more revenue dependent, and that's caused all sorts of issues in the UK context specifically. So that's why I do think there is merit in talking about genuinely, authentically, as trustees, as leaders and as artists, talking about place-based thinking, of systems thinking about arts and culture, and you know, where those organizations are closing, what's the capital, the social capital, the artistic capital that we really need to maintain, and how do we do that as well as we possibly can do.
Yes, I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts on that, but you know, really the question is, and how do we decide who to save? You know, I don't know if anybody has any more views about that, and actually, you know, less about you know, more about what brings value in the eyes and minds of the public. You know. Any other thoughts on that? Anybody? No, good. it's quite a sort of a kind of warm potato, that one, isn't it? In that case, I'm just going to pick up last question here, which is quite a popular one as well, from Russell. You can all say that in the question. In talking of embedding artists in communities, it shouldn't preclude finding artists who live or were raised in those communities already, and ways of continuing inequity by pushing opportunities for artists already valorised in the arts system, rather than those that need it most. So again, I think that comes back to, you know, huge theme, but some of those questions around cultural democracy that both, I think, Moira and Chenine raised in their talks, and of course is in Franco's as well. Any last thoughts from anybody on Russell's comment?
I'll just pick up on it, Anne. I totally agree with this point, and as we become more place-based, it's really how we work with artists who already live in these places to look at how they are embedded. I think there are certainly some artists that are, but there are many artists that don't work in communities. They create their own work and they perform or present it in galleries and theatres. So there's a real disconnect there. So whilst I totally agree that there are artists on the ground in communities, and it's absolutely essential we're working with them and that they're supported and invested in, as well as you know, what you might call artists maybe who haven't been doing this as a career but are still artistic and creative. There's work to be done, I think, with the artists that haven't been doing that, because they're in danger a little bit, I think. You know, they need to be much better connected. And certainly when you think of things like key worker status and, you know, that understanding of supporting people who are needed to keep the country together, there's a great role for artists to play in that statement as key workers, but you know, not all artists, you know, probably the majority of artists aren't doing that, and yet they play such a significant role in many other ways. So it's just understanding how we do that and bringing them forward, as well as investing, you know, and investing locally is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and I guess that question about the valuing the diversity of artists as well, you know, and really a really interesting debate, of which we're going to have more at another time. So I think we knew it was a bit tight. I think we've had a great deal of richness, some really, really interesting, enriching themes there. And of course, as all the best debates, I think it's just laid down a gauntlet of more interesting questions to follow up with. So I don't know if we could just flip back to our slides just to sort of finish off, really, because there are opportunities to pick up some of these themes, because at the formal launch of the Centre for Cultural Value, which is happening from the 2nd to the 9th of November. Have I got my dates right? Let me just check. No, sorry, from the 2nd to the 13th of November, we are launching the Centre for Cultural Value, and it will be full of interesting debates like the one we've just been having here. We really are very committed to the idea of interactivity. So if you come along to any of those, there will be chances to get involved and to speak as much as to listen on those events. For that very reason, we'd really like your feedback about what you've heard today, both in terms of the content and the format, but what feel like really interesting things to follow up and so on. We'll be looking at that chat with great interest, and some of that will be reflected in the final version of those digests that Rachel and John have been working on, and we're going to be sending those to you if you're interested, and they'll be ready in about a month's time. So meanwhile, I'm just going to say thank you all so much for engaging with us in this format. So sad that we couldn't all now wander around and have a coffee in the same space together one day. And just to say huge thank you to all our speakers. I'm just completely buzzing with ideas and questions. But anyway, we all know where each other is. And if you would like to follow up on any of those questions, do please get in touch with Mikey, who organised all of this. He will post any question that you have to any of the other panelists or attendees or people who've been on part of this this online event. So if you want to stay connected, use Mikey as the glue. And finally, just to say thank you again to Centre for Cultural Value and to our speakers for taking part. Thank you all very much. See you soon somewhere.